incident of 20th October 2020. The panel conducted 186 petitions, and we have 52 yet to be taken. The Lekki investigation was completed by the panel, and the panel is working on its report. For petitions not concluded and those not even opened at all, the files will be recommended in our report to be sent back to the Lagos State Ministry of Justice, the supervising ministry, for the purposes of government's consideration of whatever body that would take up handling of human rights violations in Lagos State. In respect of Lekki investigations and individual petitions concluded, the panel will submit in its report the outcome of findings in respect of Lekki individual petitions and make the necessary recommendation on compensation to be paid to the petitioners. To the Nigerian Police Force petitions, we've heard the decisions. We will make the appropriate recommendations in our report for payment of compensation on deserving petitions. You will not be left out. That was why we hurriedly took the hearings, so that the recommendations would go along in the reports of the panel.
Welcome back. It's the NSAS conversation that hogs the headlines here today on the program. As you've seen there, we've got Mr. Adegboruwa, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, and a member of the both groups of which you are a strong member of.
Yes, thank you very much. That reasoning resonates with me perfectly well. As a lawyer, as an activist, and a stakeholder within the Nigeria project, you know, the issue of NSAS, the issue of police brutality, the issue of engagement of law enforcement agencies with civilians is nothing new at all. If you trace it back to our independence, the law enforcement agencies have had the idea of a force of occupation. And that history has continued and affected, in most very worrisome ways, the relationship between uniform entities and indeed the general populace. And it's not limited to the police. We talk about the Nigeria Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the EFCC, the ICPC, the agencies that are saddled with the responsibility of enforcing laws, generally have the idea of some kind of forced superiority over citizens, whereby once a uniform officer appears, you're supposed to obey completely without any expression of any rights whatsoever. And so when you look at events happening in the past 1 year, and indeed times before them, I expected that today probably will be a day of sobriety, a day of proper reflection, a day of national healing, especially for the government in terms of whatever lessons that may have been learned in the past 1 year. If you ask me, Chamberlain, I expected that many months to this anniversary, the government should have engaged the youth, organized programs, agree with them on venues for such programs, because the lesson from the NSAS protest is purely lack of communication, lack of engagement. So I didn't expect that we will still be in a position whereby people say we will protest, government will say no, don't protest. It just shows that we're back to square one, and probably we have not learned anything. I expected that by today, this day will have been declared as a national public holiday by the government, and then use the opportunity to engage in the youth, to engage the civil society, and look at how to generally transform the areas where complaints are quite serious, especially in relation to police engagement with civilians. So I agree with the National Nigerian Bar Association and in this civil society that rather than getting better, it will just seem that things are taking a turn for the worse, and it's quite unfortunate. So I believe that in the course of time, going forward, the government would...
Okay, I was going to just say that, that many will be struggling now to kind of find or make sense out of the panel that was set up in different parts of the country. So there will be those who will wonder, does that then mean that these panels that were set up is just more or less like a facade if there hasn't been corresponding action to buttress or underscore the fact that they do mean well when they were set up?
Well, I think that the government, from my own understanding, had a desire to address the issues raised by the youth in particular, and then the people of Nigeria in general. And so that's why, for instance, those panels are in nature judicial, headed by very well experienced and tested judicial officers. Those panels also have members of civil society and in particular representatives of the youth. And in some cases, particularly in Lagos, the panels have fairly been allowed some measure of independence, from my own understanding, in terms of the running of their affairs. But you can see that in order to do a thorough job, it was not possible within 1 year for most of these, some of these panels to conclude their assignments. So I believe that maybe government is yet to receive and for deliberation the reports of all the panels in order to highlight the areas and recommendations for implementation. So it is not that the panels are not useful or do not affect the expectations of our people, but I think that will still take more time in terms of conclusion of the reports of the various panels, and then for the National Executive Council and indeed government and the governors of the various states to take the positive recommendations from those panels for implementation. So I think it may be too early to give a verdict on the usefulness or otherwise of the various panels until probably all reports are concluded, and then we can take the recommendations and see what government can learn from there. But I was just talking generally, even outside of the panel, that I expected that with or without the panel, the government had a responsibility before now to have engaged the youth, the protesters, and in generally civil society and NGOs in forming a common position on relationship between law enforcement agencies and the populace. Because, Kimberly, whether we like it or not, there will always be protests. There will always be issues that the people, whether youth, whether politicians, whether civil organizations, or indeed the masses of our people will disagree with government on certain policies. So you cannot generally sit down and outlaw expression because it's a freedom granted by the Constitution. So I am surprised, for instance, that we are still at a stage whereby a commissioner of police will say, we have banned gathering together. We will only allow such and such. We will only allow indoors. We will only allow virtual. I thought that by now we probably, even without the panels, have a common agreement on the mode of engagement between people who are dissatisfied with government policies and indeed the agencies saddled with the responsibility of law enforcement, so that we can have a situation whereby people will gather to protest and the police will be there in their midst, offer protection, shield them around, and ensure that nothing amiss, will occur, either to people who are not part of the protest or even to the protesters themselves. That's what I mean by saying that it seems that we have not learned any lesson from the NSAS protest.
What you said, you talked about the panels, and I mean the reports are instruments for government to take action. But from your perspective as an active participant, do you think the people who engaged or who were engaged by the various panels, the one you sat at inclusive, do you think the people felt listened to? Do you think it achieved anything with the people? Without the reports that are instruments for government to take necessary action, do you think the people felt appeased, listened to better?
Oh, no doubt at all, Ayo. From my own personal experience and engagement for the past 1 year that the Lagos panel has sat, one of the things that I look back and feel satisfied that I accepted to serve in that panel is the issue of immediate justice to complainants, to petitioners. You know, the general attitude is the sense of impunity, where maybe law enforcement agencies trample upon the rights of the citizens, and it seems that nothing can happen. I mean, and I think that generally is what I'm happy about. You see petitioners who made allegations against police officers, and the panel is able to compel the attendance of such police officers to come and face the petitioners who otherwise would have been regarded as having no voice. And the panel will listen. Lawyers will interrogate such officers. The respondents would be made accountable to the actions that took place many years ago and probably which he thought nobody would ever query him. So you see a sense of relief on the face of the petitioners when they sit down there and they confront the people who had allegedly trampled upon their rights. So I have no doubt at all that some kind of immediate relief and remedy had gone from especially the Lagos panel. And the second thing is this. When you talk about infringement of rights of people and brutality, you look at what remedy can assuage such infringement immediately. And this is the area where the Lagos State panel is different from the other panels, because we had an immediate compensation for victims. The Lagos State government committed itself to a particular amount of money for the victims whose petitions are deemed to be successful. So, for instance, people who had health challenges and require immediate treatment, we thought that it was necessary for us to offer compensation immediately, so that, you could take the amount offered to take care of yourself and they receive immediate and comprehensive medical treatment. So in a number of cases where we saw that, the allegations were proved in respect of injuries suffered from police brutality, the panel awarded compensation immediately and ensured that the victims were paid. And we had had occasions whereby after receiving those payments, people have used it to go and take care of their health or even to better their lives by setting up appropriate businesses that could earn some kind of income to compensate for those kind of injuries. And I think that's what the government should consider generally in terms of the reports from the other states and the eventual report from the Lekki toll gate incident, that people should feel that justice has been not only been done, but has been seen to have been done effectively, whereby it's not a matter that will be subjected to government bureaucracy. You must give remedy to people immediately based on the recommendations of the panels. So I have no doubt whatsoever in my mind that it may not be adequate in any way, but somehow some immediate remedy has come to petitioners who came to the Lagos panel. Unfortunately, we could not hear all the petitions that were before us.
To the extent of those remedies that you reference, on the back of some of those positives, I should say, that have come out of the panel and by extension the End SARS protests. To what extent then would you say nothing has really changed? Because you said that statement really resonates with you, but yet you still chronicle some of the remedies that have come out of those panels and protests by extension. So when you say nothing has changed, how do you situate that?
Yeah, what I meant by nothing has changed, Kyle, is in respect of engagement between government, the law enforcement agencies, and indeed the citizens of Nigeria. It's not just limited to End SARS protests or indeed petitioners that appear before the panel. I had in mind the recognition of the rights of citizens under the Constitution, especially Chapter 4, that gives the freedom of to citizens to assemble freely, gives freedom to citizens to express themselves without interference. And these are matters beyond the panel, for instance. So I'm just talking generally as an activist, not necessarily as a member of the panel. But I didn't expect that 1 year after the NSAS panel, today in particular, there will still be declarations by law enforcement agencies proscribing gathering of people or to outlaw general expression by citizens. So that's what I meant by nothing has changed. But in terms of the compensation to victims that appeared before us, I had no doubt at all that some kind of relief came their way from the Lagos panel in particular, and eventually probably from the other panels of other states when their recommendations get to the government. I was just talking generally in terms of the respect of the rights of citizens and the enforcement of those rights.
I know you know that there's a lot of focus, and it was so much so during when that part was mentioned, what transpired in Lekki. Were there shootings, were there killings or not? Yes, you submitted the report to the governor, but many are just wondering, okay, what could be in that report? Was there any conclusions reached? What's the government going to do with the reports? Are they supposed to make it public? When will that be made public? So many still don't have closure about that big question mark on what happened in Lekki.
Yes, thank you, Timberlake. Indeed, we are conscious from our own perspective at the panel that there is a lot of expectation from the people of Nigeria, deservedly, and indeed the international community to know what exactly happened at the Lekki toll gate on the 20th of October 2020. What we have done at the panel first was to open the floodgate for anybody who had any complaint in respect of that incident to appear before us unfettered. Bring your witnesses, bring your petitions, and come without any restraints and share your testimonies and make your allegations known. So to that extent, we listen to the NSAS protesters themselves in groups led by their lawyers. We listen to the Nigerian army, with all their evidences and documents led by their lawyers. We listen to experts. Doctors came from various hospitals. For instance, we listened to the pathologist of Lagos State, Professor Bafunwa, and we listened to the Lagos State government itself, who came before us, represented by very high-ranking officers. And we took our time to receive evidence virtually from everybody, from the Lekki Concession Company. The panel itself had its own experts that it hired and paid independently to work on certain materials for our own use and study. And we listened to that expert. The Lagos State government itself brought a ballistic expert before the panel. And so we took, for instance, Kimberly, close to 400 video evidence, flash drives of various events and allegations and occurrences. And we listened to testimonies from several experts. So it would take us some little time. What we wanted to do was to ensure that we separated the Lekki tollgate investigation from the general petitions of abuses and brutality. And so we wanted to hear as many petitions as possible. That was why we sat even until the last day on the 18th. So what we are to do now as a judicial body, having listened to the Lekki tollgate testimonies and received the evidences, we now go into conference. We have to look at those evidences. We have to watch the videos. We have to review the testimonies. And so it's not something that we wanted to rush on our own because the expectation is high. Everybody wants to know the truth about what happened. And we're going to have to review those testimonies and then come up with our own findings and the recommendations. And in deserving cases, recommendations for compensation. So normally in the Nigerian court system, when a court stops sitting, it has 3 months from the last day of sitting to be able to submit its report or deliver its judgment. So from the 18th of October, we have sufficient time to be able to sit down at conferences within the panel and come to some kind of conclusion based on our findings of what we thought happened at Lekki tollgate on the 20th of October. So we only appeal to Nigerians and indeed the international community and government and the protesters themselves to give us time. Having now listened to them, we will need sufficient time, maybe 1 month or a little more, at least before the end of the year, I can assure you that the report of the Lagos State panel will be made available.
Made available and public? Mr.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I said made available and public.
Well, Ayo, it's, you know, we need to weigh the options. It's a panel set up by the Lagos State government. So to that extent, our responsibility is to submit the report to the Lagos State government in the first place. And if you ask me personally, Ayo, I believe the report should be made public. And I'll tell you why. The Lagos State government appeared before the panel as a petitioner. It submitted evidences, it took a position before the panel. So we sat over Lagos State government as a panel. So it would be inappropriate, for instance, for Lagos State government to receive our report and begin to deliberate on it, knowing that Lagos State government had come before the panel and had taken a position on what happened in Lekki on 20th of October. So I personally do not expect that a party that had appeared before the panel will then go back to be reviewing the report of the panel before which it appeared. But we have a responsibility to submit the report to the government that sets up the panel. And it's our expectation that that report will be made public and will not be subject to further review by the Lagos State government that appeared before the panel itself and led evidences and gave testimonies and took a position before the panel. Otherwise, it will probably more or less make a mockery of whatever job we have done. And every day, the governor had restated that the panel was independent. The panel will not be subjected to any form of interference. And I can speak to you here this morning, Ayo. I have never been approached by anybody in respect of my own assignment at the panel. We have operated independently. We have met independently. And we will continue to meet at that level to ensure that whatever our finding will be is based on our conscience, is based on the evidence laid before us, and is based on law.
And I mean, to what extent really can people expect that this will be made public? Because on the one hand, you referenced that the Lagos State government appeared before the panel, yes, but the panel was also inaugurated by the government, essentially, and we had this across states. So is there a possibility, really, that this, I don't know what the terms of reference was. I know there were issues earlier on about whether or not issues should be made public, and I recall that was resolved. So is there anything in the terms of reference that points to the fact that this may not be released eventually?
No, Kyle, there's nothing like that, I can assure you. And you will notice the composition of the panel is very unique. The protesters themselves, represented by the youth, are represented in the panel. Civil society is represented in the panel. Government is represented in the panel. The police is represented in the panel. The National Human Rights Commission is represented in the panel. I mean, you expect that I will have my own copy of the report. The various members of the constituencies that are represented at the panel will have their own copies of the final report. So I don't think that anybody can play any game with the outcome of the findings of the panel. I mean, when I have my own copy, I'm supposed to go back to my constituency and brief them. I'm talking about civil society, Nigerian Bar Association, and non-government organizations and stakeholders generally that I represent. So I think that our responsibility will be first to submit the report to the government, believing in good faith that the government would in turn transmit that report to the National Executive Council, and then it will be made public. But if it comes to a situation whereby there's any secrecy or some kind of controversy concerning the report, those of us who are members of the report, the panel, have our own copies of the authentic report, and we'll know what to do at the appropriate time. Carol.
That as well, because I mean, does that then suggest that when it's transmitted to the Lagos State government, are they supposed to make it public before onward transmission to NEC? And what is NEC supposed to do thereafter?
Well, Timberlane, I don't want us to...
no, from your own expectation, that's what I mean.
Yes, my expectation is, for instance, is to take you back to what the Honorable Speaker of the House of Representatives, Right Honorable Femi Gbajabiamila, said in the course of this NSAS issue. You recall that he said then that he will not sign a budget that does not include provisions for compensation for victims of police brutality. And we have that at the back of our mind. So our expectation genuinely is that this report will be made public. That's my own personal expectation, and that's the expectation of the panel. But we do not want to prejudge the steps that government may take. But I assure you that independently, we will not allow the outcome of the Lagos State panel report in particular to be suppressed in any manner whatsoever.
All right, well, just a quick one before we wrap this up. NSAS 545 demands. It will seem like, of course, this panel is one of those things. It's actually item 3. But there are those who are asking, what's happened to item 1, immediate release of all arrested protesters? There are reports that some of the protesters are still in incarceration. Justice for all deceased victims of police brutality and appropriate compensation for their families. Setting up of, there you have it on the screen, in line with the new Police Act, psychological evaluation and retraining to be confirmed by an independent body of all disbanded SARS officers before they can be redeployed. And number 5, increased police salary so that they are adequately compensated for protecting lives and property of citizens. What would be your assessment of our approach to these?
Well, thank you very much, Ayo. I listened to the clip of the video you played where the chairperson of the panel, Honorable Justice Okuobi, made allusion to the fact that we listened to even petitions from the police officers themselves who complain of certain abuses. Our job has been largely comprehensive in addressing those issues that you have highlighted, the 545 demands of the NSAS protesters. We made appropriate recommendations. We have made, for instance, recommendations regarding the release of properties of petitioners that were seized. We made recommendations in appropriate cases for the prosecution of police officers who have been identified in respect of allegations of brutality. We made recommendations, for instance, for worship to children and family members of people who were victims and have died in respect of brutality. And we would then also address the major issues that we thought came up before the panel, one of which was the issue of enforcement of judgments, by victims of police brutality who on their own went to court. And
okay, it appears as though we seem to have lost you there. But, well, we do get your point. Mr. Adegboruwa Adegboruwa, Senior Advocate of Nigeria and a member of the NSAS panel in Lagos representing civil society groups. So you heard his perspective there. So that is it for this segment. But we're still talking about NSAS when we return in just a moment. Don't go away.